Welcome to this course, Introduction to Cybersecurity Literacy. This is Lesson 6, Demystifying the Internet, Part 1 of 3. What is the Internet, really, and how does it work? Addressing these questions now will help you to understand some of the security vulnerabilities that we will discuss in later lessons. To begin, imagine for a moment that you live in a world with computers, but without the Internet. Imagine that you are, say, a physicist, and imagine that you use your laboratory computer to collect and store data from your physics experiments. Now imagine that several of your coworkers, fellow physicists and lab assistants, require access to your data as well. Now, one way to grant your coworkers access to this data is to let them use your computer. Sharing computers is nice as far as it goes, but it has some obvious limitations. For example, what could happen if everybody needed to use the computer at the same time? Because it's not always practical to share computers, you and your coworkers would probably look for some way to share the data itself instead. You could copy the data onto disks or flash drives and walk it over to your coworkers' workstations, but that too would have some obvious limitations, especially if some of your coworkers' workstations were on another floor of your building, or maybe even in a different building altogether. Another way to share data would be to network your computers together, allowing them to share data directly. Such a method could allow thousands of users to share huge stores of information almost immediately across a large number of individual workstations. Indeed, this is what countless organizations have chosen to do. Most companies and large organizations have some kind of computer network. An organization with a computer network enjoys many advantages over an organization with unconnected computers. For example, networked computers make it easier to access, distribute, and back up important information. They can provide users the flexibility to log into their workstation or into their network account from multiple locations. And networks allow users to connect individual workstations to some kind of central work hub, such as a printer and copy center or a conference room. So now let's imagine that you and your physicist coworkers have developed a computer network that allows you to share important data with users across your organization. Furthermore, let's imagine that another group of physicists on the other side of town also works on their own network of computers. It's easy to imagine that these two groups of physicists would know each other and they might naturally be interested in each other's research. So maybe they would get together, and maybe they would decide that it would be mutually beneficial if they could join their networks together into one big data-sharing network. When multiple networks join together like this into a network of networks, that is called internetworking. The internet is one giant piece of internetworking. It's a network of many computer networks, all internetworked together. The internet is not the only example of internetworking, but it's the biggest example in the world, and as you know, it's the one that you are most likely to interact with on a daily basis. When you begin to network large numbers of computers together, you need increasingly complex systems of cables and data transfer devices to keep this network connected together. When these networks connect diverse people, organizations, and business interests over a large geographic area, a few important questions naturally arise. One is, who owns the networking devices that make the internet possible, and who is responsible for fixing them when they break? The short answer is that organizations called Internet Service Providers, or ISPs, own and maintain the physical networking cables and networking devices that facilitate the internet. And who are the Internet Service Providers, you might ask? They are mostly big private companies, such as Time Warner or Comcast, while some others are government agencies. Another question that's useful to answer is this: how do computers communicate across the network? For computers to communicate with each other, they need a well-defined set of communication rules. That's because computer messages have precise, unambiguous meaning. We humans are used to dealing with ambiguity. If we hear an ambiguous sentence from another human, we can ask for clarification, or we might make an educated guess at what the person meant to say. But computers don't work this way. Computers need precise, unchanging, and unambiguous rules in order to communicate well with each other. Any strict, fixed set of communications rules is called a communications protocol. In order to network computers together, the computers on the network must share a common protocol. And as you could probably guess, in order to internetwork multiple networks together, these networks must also agree on a common internetworking protocol. Every device that is networked together on the internet uses a particular protocol called Internet Protocol, which is usually abbreviated IP. One of the features of Internet Protocol, which will come up later in this course, is that Internet Protocol requires a unique address, called an IP address, for every device that is connected to the internet. All of the web pages, files, and software that is accessible on the internet has to be stored on some kind of device that's connected to the network. Every time one device requests a file from another device on the internet, it needs to specify where the file is stored. Now, IP addresses allow devices to do that. And whenever that data request is fulfilled, the device providing the data needs to know which other device it's supposed to deliver the data to. Again, IP addresses allow devices to do that. Running the internet without IP addresses would be a little like running the postal service without mailing addresses. So, in summary, the internet is a vast network of other networks all networked together. Internet service providers, or ISPs, are the organizations that own the cables and networking devices that the internet runs on. Computers need strict sets of communication rules, called protocols, in order to communicate with each other, and the communications protocol of the internet is called Internet Protocol, or IP. Finally, every device on the internet gets its own IP address. That's all for now. In the next lesson, we'll discuss how the internet is structured and how IP addresses get assigned to all those devices on the internet. Welcome to this course, Introduction to Cybersecurity Literacy. This is Lesson 7, Demystifying the Internet, Part 2 of 3. In this lesson, we will examine some illustrations that will help us to see the internet in greater detail. Some of you may be watching this video as part of a course that uses this textbook. If you are, you should know that the illustrations in this video are from Chapter 2 of the book. If you aren't using this book, don't worry about it, just follow along with the video. This first illustration models the mysterious cloud view of the internet. Casual users see information go into and come out of the internet, and they understand what kinds of information and services are available. Email services, web pages, online retailers, banking institutions, and more. But they may not understand how that information is networked together. Let's take a closer look at the structure of the internet so that the cloud is not so mysterious. This next illustration begins to show how the internet is networked together in a little more detail. It shows how the internet is arranged loosely into a hierarchy. At the top of the hierarchy is what is referred to as the backbone of the internet. The backbone of the internet consists of the largest set of internet service providers, or ISPs as they're called. An ISP is an organization that owns, controls, and maintains a large number of the computer networking cables and networking devices that make the internet possible. These largest ISPs include corporations, governments, and in some cases large academic organizations. The connections linking the biggest ISPs together are modeled by red arrows in this illustration. These arrows represent the network cables that carry the most information. Most internet traffic must travel through one of these backbone connections at some point as it travels across the net. As we work our way down the hierarchy, we see that there is a tier of medium-sized ISPs. These medium-sized ISPs are responsible for considerably less internet traffic and considerably fewer cables and networking devices than the backbone ISPs are. But they are still responsible for a huge amount of traffic. In this illustration, the blue arrows represent the internet traffic between these medium ISPs and the backbone ISPs above them. The green arrows represent the connection between the medium ISPs and an organization further down the hierarchy. As we can see in the illustration, a business with its own private internal network might connect its many users directly to one of these blue medium-sized ISPs. However, a residential user might connect to the medium ISPs through an even smaller local ISP. These small, local ISPs that connect residents to the internet are often controlled by a local cable company or a local phone company. The connection between the smallest tier of ISPs and an individual residence is represented here by a purple arrow. The connection represented by the purple arrow might carry a lot of information, streaming video, file downloads, or maybe online games, but that quantity of information is just nothing compared to the quantity represented by the arrows higher up on the hierarchy. So there it is. This illustration shows us how internet service providers are organized into a hierarchy, with the ISPs on the top handling the most data and the ISPs and residents on the bottom handling the least data. This next illustration shows something else. As you may already know, every device that is connected to the internet has a unique address called an IP address. This illustration shows a couple different ways that IP addresses get assigned to devices. This diagram includes three fictional networks: the XYZ Office Network, the ABC Office Network, and the Joe's Coffee Shop Network. To keep the diagram relatively simple, the rest of the internet has been condensed down into a cloud in the middle of the illustration. First, let's take a look at the XYZ Office Network on the left side of the illustration. Those red numbers are the IP addresses for the whole network. Every IP address is numerical like that. They are always written as 4 sets of digits, each separated by a period. Each of these 4 sets of digits can be any number from 0 to 255. So take a look at the IP address of the XYZ network. It's 197.12.15.0. All of the devices connected to the XYZ network will be assigned IP addresses that begin with the first 3 sets of digits, 197.12.15. Device IP addresses ending in 0 are restricted, and device IP addresses ending in 255 are also reserved, so in practice, the range of possible IP addresses for devices on this network are 0.1 to 0.254. As we can see in the illustration, the router at the XYZ Office Network has been assigned the IP address ending in 0.254. Meanwhile, Carol's desktop computer has been assigned the IP address ending in 0.10. There are 252 IP addresses remaining in the available range for this network. The XYZ Office Network uses static IP address assignments. Static IP addresses are unchanging. That means that for the foreseeable future, Carol's desktop has been permanently assigned this particular IP address. 197.12.15.10 is permanently reserved for her computer. The opposite of static IP address assignment is dynamic IP address assignment. For an example of dynamic IP address assignment, let's take a look at the ABC Office Network over on the right side of the illustration. The ABC Office Network is at the IP address 207.10.2.0. Just like in the case of the XYZ Office Network, devices connecting to the network can use any IP address starting with those first 3 numbers and ending with any number from 1 to 254. For example, on this network, the router took the IP address ending in 254, Bob's computer took the address ending in 15, and Alice's computer took the address ending in 5. But unlike the XYZ network, the ABC Office Network uses dynamic IP addresses instead of static IP addresses. This means that some of these IP addresses are subject to change. You see, the ABC Office Network has a special piece of hardware called a Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol Server, or a DHCP server, as it's often abbreviated. The Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol Server assigns a device one of the 254 possible network IP addresses each time a device begins a new internet session. The DHCP server will lease each IP address for a set period of time, and after that time passes, then the device will have to renew its lease. I know that I'm throwing a lot of new information at you, but I promise that the underlying concept isn't very difficult. All we're saying is that, for example, Bob's computer has the IP address ending in 0.15 for now, but it might be assigned a new IP address once the hour is up. What are the advantages and disadvantages of dynamic IP addresses versus static IP addresses? Well, the advantage of a static IP address, like Carol has on her computer, is that her IP address is always available to her. She has a reserved place on the router. When IP addresses are assigned dynamically, as they are for Bob's computer over here, then there's a chance that there won't be any room for him when he tries to connect to the network. If the DHCP server has already assigned all the IP addresses available to it, then there won't be any left for Bob. The advantage of dynamic IP address assignment is that dynamic assignments are more flexible. thousands of different devices could connect to the ABC network, and as long as they don't all try to connect at the same time, the DHCP server can assign them all an IP address on the network. Let's look down at the bottom of this illustration to see one more network configuration that also uses dynamic IP address assignments. Joe's Coffee Shop network is at IP address 207.10.3.0. This means that devices connected to it can take the IP addresses beginning with those three numbers and ending with a number between 1 and 254. Over the course of, say, a month, a coffee shop could probably expect to have many more than just 254 devices connect to their wireless connection. But at any given time throughout the day, they would probably have only a few devices connected, maybe 50 or so. This is a perfect situation for dynamic IP address assignments. The network only has 254 IP addresses that it can assign, but it can easily accommodate all of its users by assigning these addresses on a temporary basis only to the users who are active on the network. But remember, when we were examining the ABC Office network connection, we saw that a network needs a dynamic host configuration protocol server in order to accommodate dynamic IP addressing. Where is the DHCP server at Joe's Coffee Shop? The answer is that at Joe's Coffee Shop, the DHCP server is combined with the internet router. Instead of the router and the DHCP server being two separate devices, they're integrated together into a single device. This is pretty common. Most home internet routers also have DHCP servers built into them, and so most home networks can accommodate dynamic IP address assignments. So, what are the big takeaways from this illustration? I want you to see that a computer's IP address usually depends on a router's IP address. I also want you to see that your device's IP address can change depending on what network it's on and depending on whether the network uses dynamic or static IP address assignment. Finally, I want you to note the structure of an IP address, that it's 4 numbers separated by periods. The last illustration that we will examine in this lecture models the difference between a public IP address and a private IP address. In our discussion of IP addresses so far, we have not been making the distinction between public and private IP addresses. I've been speaking as if all IP addresses are the same, but there is a significant difference between public IP addresses and private IP addresses. This illustration shows 2 different networks that are connected to the internet: Alice's home network and Bob's home network. Alice's home network is composed of 2 devices, a router and Alice's computer. Bob's home network is composed of 4 devices, a router, Bob's computer, Carol's computer, and a printer. Let's take a look at Bob's home network on the right side of this illustration. Bob's local internet service provider has only assigned him 1 IP address, but he would like to connect 2 computers to the internet, his and Carol's, and furthermore, he'd like to connect his wireless printer to his home network. The rules of IP require that every device has its own IP address, but Bob's internet service provider has only given him 1 IP address to work with. So what does Bob do? He will use his router to create a private home network to connect his 4 devices together. And then he'll connect his entire home network to the public internet through the IP address that his internet service provider has assigned him. From the perspective of somebody outside on the public internet, Bob appears to have only 1 device connected to the internet, and that's his router. But Bob's router can coordinate Bob's public internet connection with multiple devices on his private network. So from within the private network, we can see that there are really 3 more devices connected to the public internet through Bob's router. Now let's compare Bob's home network to Alice's home network on the bottom left portion of the illustration. Both networks have a public IP address, and those public IP addresses are unique. Indeed, every public IP address must be unique. However, Bob's and Alice's routers help them to create private networks, and these private networks can reuse the same IP addresses. For example, we can see that Alice's computer's private IP address is identical to Bob's computer's private IP address. This repetition is possible because of the distinction between their private IP addresses and their public IP addresses. It's kind of like how every apartment building in a city must have a unique street address for the post office to deliver mail to. But at each unique street address, the apartment buildings can reuse the same apartment numbers. Okay, I know that we've covered a lot of ground here with these illustrations, so let's take a break. In the next video, we'll examine a few more illustrations that will help us to see how information is routed through the internet. Welcome to this course, Introduction to Cybersecurity Literacy. This is Lesson 8, Demystifying the Internet, Part 3 of 3. In this lecture, we will examine a few illustrations that help us to see how information travels through the many twists and turns of the Internet. When you use the Internet, what you're doing is using your computer to send information or requests for information to other computers. These computers that store and deliver information are examples of networking computers called servers. Here's an image of a technician who's examining a large network server. When you send an email, you are telling your computer to send a message to be stored on a mail server. When you read your own email, you're asking your computer to access messages that have been stored for you on a server. When you view a web page, you're using your computer to display a web document that somebody else uploaded to a web server. When you download media files from internet stores like iTunes, Amazon, or Google Play, information is copied from a server to your computer. Not quite all internet content is on servers, though. Peer-to-peer sharing software allows users to download files directly from each other's internet-connected personal computers rather than from a large central server. In either case, internet activity is the activity of machines sending information and information requests to each other. As we learned in previous lessons, every machine connected to the internet is affiliated with a unique IP address. When machines send information and information requests to each other, they send them to these IP addresses. And as we've seen in previous lessons, IP addresses are long strings of numbers. Computers have no trouble working with long, apparently random strings of numbers. But as you can imagine, we humans have trouble reading and remembering long strings of numbers like that. Think about it. How many IP addresses can you name from memory? I would guess that the answer is 0. And yet you probably request information from servers at various IP addresses every single day. So how do we use the internet without knowing the IP addresses of various servers? The answer is that we assign natural human language names to places on the internet. These natural names are called domain names. Both email addresses and web addresses are common examples of domain names. When you submit either an email address or a web address, your computer has to translate those domain names into numerical IP addresses. So when you punch in a web address, an email address, or any other domain name, how does your computer figure out what numerical IP address it should look for? The answer is that your computer must access a domain name service server, or DNS server for short. I'm going to show you what that looks like. I'm going to use a couple illustrations from this textbook. Some of you may be taking a formal course that uses this textbook, but if you're not, that's okay. Just follow along with the video. This illustration helps us to see how domain name services work. In this illustration, Bob wants to visit www.dougj.net. When Bob submits the URL www.dougj.net into the address bar on his browser, his computer accesses a system called the Domain Name Service, or DNS. Internet-capable computers have an application on board that allows them to access this domain name service. Bob's computer will send a request to the DNS server at his local internet provider. This request asks the DNS server, "Hey, what's the IP address for dougj.net?" Sometimes the local server already knows the answer, and so it can simply answer the question right away. However, the local DNS server may not know the answer, and in that case, the request gets sent further up the server tree to a higher level DNS server, and the question gets repeated. If the question isn't answered, it gets sent even further up the tree to a root server. A root server is responsible for a tremendous number of domain names. For example, a root server might be responsible for all domain names that end in .com, or all domain names that end in .net. The root server must either know the IP address for all of these domains, or at least it must know where to find these IP addresses. If the root server doesn't know the IP address for dougj.net, it knows how to route the request so that it makes it to a server that does know. The root server might send the request back down the tree to a different lower-level DNS server, which might eventually send the request to the local DNS server for dougj.net. If this domain name exists, then the local DNS server will definitely know its IP address. In this case, the requested IP address is 129.186.105.24. The IP address gets sent back through the network of DNS servers, and eventually it makes it back to Bob's computer. Once Bob's computer knows the proper numerical IP address, it can make an information request from the machine storing the web page data. Bob's computer might now store the IP address for later use. Although it takes a while to explain the process of accessing an IP address from a DNS server, the computers involved carry out this operation so rapidly that we normally don't even realize that anything has happened. Okay, that's how DNS servers help coordinate IP addresses. Now let's look at another common networking device, routers. Throughout this introduction to the internet, I have mentioned machines called routers, and I have referred to some information being routed across the web. But with all of the millions of devices connected to the internet, how exactly do routers direct traffic to the right IP addresses? Well, let me show you. This next illustration helps us to see how information is routed. In this illustration, we have two networks, Network 1 and Network 2. You might notice that Router 1 is connected to both networks, and so it has two different IP addresses. When you're looking at Router 1 as a member of Network 1, then its IP address is 192.168.1.1. But when you're looking at Router 1 as a member of Network 2, then its IP address is 207.20.15.1. So those two IP addresses don't refer to different devices, they just refer to the same device from different perspectives on different networks. Network 1 consists of three devices: Alice's computer, Bob's computer, and Router 1. Network 2 also consists of three devices: Carol's computer, Router 1, and Router 2. Notice that Network 1 has no direct connection to the internet. Network 1 can only connect to the internet through Network 2. Every device on a computer network has something called a route table. A route table contains instructions for routing information to a given IP address. To keep the clutter down, we have only included three of these route tables in the picture: the one for Alice's computer, the one for Router 1, and the one for Carol's computer. But the other computers and routers would also have their own route tables too. Let's look at Alice's route table first. Alice's route table has two columns: the destination column and the next hop column. When Alice's computer wants to send information to an IP address in the destination column, it follows the directions in the next hop column. The first row on her route table tells us that information going to any IP address on Network 1 will be sent directly to that IP address. For example, Alice's computer can send information directly to Bob's computer. These computers are networked together directly, so there's no need to relay the information through another network. But what happens if Alice's computer tries to send information to any other IP address, one that's not listed on the route table? For IP addresses not listed on the route table, Alice's computer will send information to the default next hop, which in this case turns out to be Router 1. Once Router 1 receives the information, it will run the destination IP address through its own route table. So let's take a look at the route table for Router 1. If information is destined for any IP address on Network 1 or Network 2, then Router 1 will send this information directly to that IP address. It can do that because it's connected directly to both of those networks. If the information is destined for any IP address outside of these two networks, then Router 1 will default to sending the information to Router 2. From Router 2, this information would continue on through the internet, most likely to be directed by several more route tables before reaching its final destination. So if Alice wanted to send information to Bob's IP address, then Alice's route table would direct that information directly to Bob's computer. If Alice wanted to send information to Carol's computer, then the route table on her computer would direct that information to Router 1, and then the route table on Router 1 would direct that information to Carol's computer. If Alice wanted to access a web page somewhere else on the internet, then the route table on her computer would direct that information to Router 1, the route table for Router 1 would direct that information to Router 2, and then so on throughout the internet until Alice's web page request reached the appropriate server somewhere on the internet. Now let's trace a couple of routes from Carol's computer. If Carol wanted to send information from her computer to Bob's computer, then her route table would direct that information to Router 1, and then the route table at Router 1 would direct that information to Bob's computer. If Carol wanted to send information to an IP address that is on neither Network 1 or Network 2, then her route table would default to sending that information to Router 2, which would then run through its route table to direct that information to the next address in line. In this illustration, we've simplified the route tables so that they're easier to understand. Real route tables have more lines of instructions than the route tables in this illustration, but I hope that you can see how complex networks can run on relatively short route tables. Indeed, the route table on your computer is probably much less than a page long, and yet it allows you to connect to potentially billions of IP addresses. Now, so far, we've examined how computers use domain name service or DNS servers to translate domain names that are easy for people to read into IP addresses that are easy for computers to read. We've also examined how computers and routers use route tables to route information through networks. Now we're going to examine one last illustration that will help you to see how computers access web pages. Web pages are special documents that are stored on high-capacity computers called web servers. When you access a web page on your computer, you send an information request to the IP address of a server, and the server sends that information back to the IP address of your computer. Your computer's web browser allows your computer to display the web page. Web pages are highly flexible documents. They can display text, images, audio, video, and interactive programs like games. But what makes web pages really special is their ability to link to other web pages. That's why we call them web pages. They're connected together like a web. As you can see in the illustration, when Bob accesses www.dougj.net, his computer accesses the web server that hosts that website. The website, dougj.net, consists of a cluster of files that are stored on that computer. Each file contains all or part of a web page, which Bob can view in his web browser. The first page that comes up when Bob navigates to dougj.net will be the home page. Because of the interconnected nature of the web, this home page can link to several other web pages. Furthermore, any of these web pages could link to any other page on the web. So a link at dougj.net could make Bob's computer request the home page for www.anothersite.net. And then Bob might begin exploring the various web pages associated with anothersite.net. In all probability, the web document files for anothersite.net would be located on a completely different server than the files associated with dougj.net. Indeed, these servers could be on opposite sides of the globe. But if Bob has a good internet connection, he can browse through those web documents stored on servers thousands of miles apart more quickly than he could browse through a book on the other side of his office. This is all thanks to the lightning quickness of electric signals and the shrewd networking techniques that we've been describing in these lessons. Okay, that's all for now on the internet. I hope that it's a little less mysterious now than it was before. Now, this course isn't intended to make you a networking wizard, but we hope that if you have a clearer mental picture of what the internet is and how it works, then you'll be better prepared to understand how the internet plays into different security issues. In the next lesson, we're going to begin learning about passwords, which are very important for cybersecurity.